Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the IEA's Global Critical Minerals Outlook 2025. Warm welcome from the IEA headquarters in Paris. My name's Tim Gould. I am the IEA's Chief Energy Economist, and I'll be saying a couple of words, but I'm actually passing quickly across to colleagues, Tae-Yoon Kim and the members of the Critical Minerals team to go through the details of this analysis. As I'm sure many of you will have seen, we released this work a couple of days ago with a press launch here in Paris together with the executive director. And what we would like to do today is to get into some of those findings, but also dig in a little bit more into the detail of the work. It's going to be a presentation by different members of the team, and it'll last, I understand, for some 20-25 minutes. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up, and we look forward very much to getting your questions, which you can insert into the Zoom, and we'll pick them up and we'll answer as many of them as we can. I'm anticipating that the whole discussion will last for around 1 hour, and we look forward very much to hearing from you. But first, just a couple of reflections on the analytical work that we do in this area. Some of you may recall back in 2021, we did a first landmark study on the role of critical minerals in energy transitions. And since that time, the work that this team does on critical minerals has really become one of the key outputs from the IEA, and it's very closely watched. And that's in part because this issue is one that has risen very far up the policy agenda. It's now a regular topic for discussion in all sorts of fora, including, of course, here at the International Energy Agency. And we had a good demonstration of that a few weeks ago when we had our summit on the future of energy security, which took place in London, organized by the UK government together with the International Energy Agency. And there too, this topic was ever present in the discussions. And I think the other reason why this analysis is very closely watched is because we've spent a lot of time and invested a lot in our capacity here at the IEA to delve into an ever wider range of questions around these critical minerals markets. And I hope that depth of knowledge, but also the data that we have assembled will be very much on show today. With that, I think it's probably already time for me to pass across to colleagues. So Tae-Yoon, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah. Thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure to introduce some of the key findings of this year's edition Global the Critical Minerals Outlook 2025. Can you put up the slide? So I'd like to start with some where the critical minerals market were in 2024. And if you look at the market, and there's some major price pressure across many minerals, especially including battery metals. And it is interesting to think about the regions for these price declines. And in fact, demand growth has been very strong across all these key energy minerals, including lithium. Demand grew almost 30% in 2024, and nickel, cobalt, graphite, rare earth element all registered some 6 to 8% annual growth. And this compares with some relatively modest demand growth for other bulk metals such as oil, natural gas, and iron ore. So demand has been quite strong, underpinned by some strong clean tech deployment. But supply growth has been even stronger for lithium and underpinned by these many countries, and also cobalt and nickel. In many cases, for refined materials led by China, but also Indonesia in the case of nickel. And this major supply increase, especially since 2021, underpins some major price decline we are seeing today in today's market. And that has an impact on various things, including the momentum for investment. So we are tracking the investment numbers for mining And after some strong growth in 2022 and 2023, we are seeing some signs of slowing down to 5% in 2024. And likewise, for exploration spending, after some years of some strong, robust growth, now exploration activity is now slowing down, and we are seeing a pause in the upward trend seen in the past few years. And some minerals such as uranium, copper, and lithium are still getting some attention, attracting investment in exploration, but some other metals such as nickel, cobalt, and zinc are remaining quite low, subdued activities. And also there are some impact on some new entrants entering this market. So today's the investment and market signals and not giving some major signal to invest in new supply, new entrant, which have some impact on diversifications. So we all know this today's the supply concentration is very high. So if you look at the refining and processing segment, in 2020, some 5 years ago, the average share of the top 3 refined material suppliers for key energy minerals was around 80%. But now in 2024, that number has to change to 86%. So diversification is the watchword and cornerstone for energy security, but the critical minerals market is heading in the opposite directions. Why is the case? Because if you look at the source of refined supply growth between 2020 and 2024, almost 90% of the supply growth for refined materials came from top 1 single supplier, China for main materials and Indonesia for nickel. And there is also contribution from top 2 players and also top 3 players, but for most others register some decline in productions. So that is one of the reasons we are seeing this diversification is heading in the other directions. And when you look at the future over some 10 years time based on the announced project, and we also see some large part of the announced planned project are being developed in today's leading the producers. So even though we see some improvement in the pace of diversification, so pace of improvement is quite marginal, so effectively returning to the level seen 2020 by 2035. So that is one of the major issues we are giving the warning to the policymakers. And some more about this volume, the supply demand balances. And we are seeing some growing number of projects announced in recent years, and that is narrowing some of the gaps between supply and demand we have seen in recent years. So supply gaps are improving for nickel and cobalt, graphite, and rare earth elements. So expected supply from announced project is catching up with the expected demand levels if these announced projects proceed on schedule. But this is not the case for some other materials such as lithium and copper. For lithium, given the strong demand growth, already some 30% per year, and we still see some big the pace of demand growth, but supply still there are some gap between expected supply and implied demand. But there's a caveat. So lithium prospect for adding some new lithium projects is much less challenging than other materials. So there are some potential for supply to catch up, but this is not the case for copper. So given today's announced project and robust pace of demand growth, we are seeing some 30% potential deficit by 2035 in the case of copper, because the copper is very much essential material for all other electrical applications and also industries and defense, high tech. So there is some robust demand prospect, but today's mining project is facing some natural decline, and also there's some lack of high quality, the large scale project in the pipeline. So industry is facing some challenges from declining resource qualities and also limited recent resource discovery, rising the capital cost, complexity. All this underpins this potential supply deficit by 2035. So this highlights some need to the scale up the new investment, the new supply, new mines, and also unlock some of the technology innovation to recover the materials from lower grade the place, and also the scale up the recycling, the supply secondary sources, and along with other efforts.
Despite many minerals appearing well supplied, this disguises some major risks appearing from and arising from high supply concentration. If for any reason supply from the largest producing country is disrupted, be it from extreme weather, technical failure, or trade disruption, the overall market balances become starkly different. For battery metals and rare earths, when we remove the demand and supply of the top supplier from the balances, supply in the rest of the world meets on average only half of remaining demand in 2035. Therefore, even in a well-supplied market, critical mineral supply chains can be highly vulnerable to supply shocks. The rapidly increasing number of export restrictions mean that these risks are no longer just a theoretical concern. The impact of a critical mineral supply shock can be far-reaching, bringing higher prices for consumers and reducing industrial competitiveness. For example, a sustained supply shock for battery metals could increase global average battery pack prices by as much as 40 to 50%. Prolonged supply disruptions could also widen cost gaps for new battery manufacturing players in diversified regions compared to China, the leading producer, and this can potentially hinder efforts to diversify manufacturing supply chains.
This year, we expanded our scope to look at a broader set of 20 energy-related minerals. In addition to energy applications, many of these minerals are also used across sectors such as high-tech, such as AI, robotics, but also aerospace and advanced manufacturing, highlighting the interlinkages between energy and economic security. Analysis of the broader group of strategic minerals reveals similarly significant risks coming from high supply chain concentration, price volatility, byproduct dependency, and others detailed in the report. For example, China is the top refiner for 19 of the 20 minerals analyzed, holding an average market share of over 70%. This high level of concentration is increasingly being matched by a context of tightening trade restrictions. Currently, more than half of these strategic minerals are subject to some form of export controls. A third point, around half of them are produced as a byproduct of other primary commodities. So, for example, for gallium, which is a mineral used for solar PV, but also in electronics. Gallium is a subproduct of aluminium refining, and so is germanium for zinc and others. This means that the flexibility of supply to respond to demand or price signals is much harder. So there's a risk of a rigid supply in case while demand varies quite a bit. And so this creates risks in times of market tightening. A fourth point, prices for these minerals tend to be quite volatile. So we analyzed the price volatility of these different commodities over the last 10 years and found that 3/4 of these minerals have shown greater price volatility than oil, and half have been more volatile than natural gas. Finally, substitution options are also sometimes very limited. Many minerals, such as tantalum, titanium, and vanadium, have few viable alternatives without major cost or performance trade-offs. So the consequences of supply disruptions can be far-reaching, impacting energy security, industrial capacity, innovation, and also technological leadership. So it's essential to understand the complex interlinkages between multiple applications, energy and sometimes high-tech, which is an area where the IEA plans to explore further in its analysis.
As we've seen so far in today's presentation, progress in diversification has been slow, and it has been difficult for new projects and entrants to find a foothold. Emerging producers often struggle with higher capital and operating costs, including for energy, labor, and transport. We estimate that upfront capital costs for projects in geographically diverse regions are typically about 50% higher than those in leading producing countries. And the sharp declines in mineral prices in recent years have also undermined the commercial viability of many projects in more diversified regions, with those producers facing higher all-in sustaining costs, making it difficult to remain profitable during commodity downturns. These cost pressures, combined with ongoing price volatility and economic uncertainty, have constrained the growth of alternative supply sources. In response, we've seen that policymakers and markets are increasingly focused on mechanisms to incentivize the development of diversified supply chains through well-designed policy support and partnerships. We've seen public financial support emerge, such as loans, subsidies, and grants, particularly for early stage or high-risk projects, which is essential to unlock near-term investment in new projects. However, there is also growing recognition that financing support on its own may not be sufficient, and that there is also a need to consider rules-based market mechanisms that can work to mitigate price risks, such as cap and floor models and contracts for differences, as well as instruments to enhance demand certainty or provide preferential market access based on sustainability requirements, which can help through favoring clean and responsible volumes.
There has been increasing interest in price and market mechanisms to support production. For example, there are discussions about price floors, with the government paying the difference when market prices fall below a threshold for critical minerals produced by projects that meet particular diversification criteria. Although these policies have the potential to mobilize private investment, experiences in other energy markets have shown various lessons about designing such interventions. We've learned that such mechanisms should balance three objectives. First, maintain some degree of merchant risk. Second, avoid excessive budgetary pressure. And third, retain flexibility for unpredictable market scenarios. This incentivizes cost-efficient production while smoothing price volatility for both producers and consumers. For example, cap and floor models can enhance predictability by compensating producers when market prices fall below a set threshold while reclaiming excess returns when prices exceed a certain level. This is more complex than price floors alone, and the calibration of reference prices can be difficult, in large part due to the small, opaque, and concentrated markets that many minerals have. Nevertheless, if carefully designed, price stabilization mechanisms can lower investment barriers without placing an undue burden on public resources.
Successful diversification efforts will also hinge on the ability to foster global collaboration between resource-rich countries and countries possessing refining capacities and downstream manufacturing infrastructure. If we take the example of rare earth elements, today, China accounts for about 65% of mined production, but a staggering 93% of refined production, as well as 90% of manufacturing capacity for permanent magnets, which contain rare earth elements and are used extensively in electric vehicles as well as wind turbines, making the midstream of rare earth element supply chains one of the most geographically concentrated. However, there are ample rare earth resources and planned mining projects across Australia, Brazil, North America, Asia, and Africa. Similarly, Europe, Malaysia, and the United States are also investing in rare earth element separation and refining facilities. And finally, permanent magnet manufacturing capacities are also starting operations or are under development in various countries in Europe, but also in Japan, Korea, and the United States. So mapping out opportunities for connections across the whole supply chain can really help realize the potential of partnerships in diversifying supply sources, followed also by cooperative frameworks such as co-investment, offtake agreements, and de-risking mechanisms. The recent joint effort that was announced between Japan and France to build a rare earth element separation facility in France provides a very good example of this. So next, I move on to a topic which is slightly different but still related to diversification, and this is innovation on the supply side. Building truly resilient and sustainable mineral supply chains in order to meet the future demand will require efforts to scale up new technologies that can increase supply volumes, improve energy efficiency of production processes, and reduce water consumption, waste generation, and emissions all along the supply chain. However, we've noticed that progress on the upstream and midstream, or so-called supply-side innovations, have been lagging compared with the speed of innovation breakthroughs on the demand side. These innovations can also help achieve various policy and security goals by enabling geographically diverse projects. Examples include the acceleration of exploration times with the use of artificial intelligence, or the lowering of energy and capital intensity of rare earths production by leveraging ionic adsorption clay deposits, or reducing energy and emissions intensity for synthetic graphite production through novel technologies, and boosting supply levels for lithium through the commercialization of direct lithium extraction. The report describes several promising technologies in mining, refining, and recycling, many of which will require further strengthening of policy support as well as R&D investments in order to bring them to commercial scale.
When considering battery supply chains, there's been a lot of focus on nickel-based lithium-ion batteries such as NMC. However, in recent years, we've seen a major rise and resurgence of LFP battery chemistries, challenging the previously dominant nickel-based chemistries. LFP accounted for less than 20% of the battery market in 2020, but now it makes up around half of the global battery market. Looking at the Battery Gigafactory project pipeline also shows other technologies such as sodium-ion batteries are emerging quickly. However, the supply chains for these emerging battery technologies are much more concentrated than for conventional nickel-based chemistries. China holds over 98% of LFP cathode material production capacity, compared to just 2/3 of nickel for nickel-based cathodes. Likewise, in the upstream, new minerals and materials are becoming increasingly important for these emerging battery technologies, but two are particularly concerning: battery-grade manganese sulfate and purified phosphoric acid. Manganese is increasingly critical for nearly all battery chemistries, nickel-based, LMFP, manganese-rich, and sodium-ion, and phosphoric acid is critical for LFP chemistries. But their supply is highly concentrated. China produces 75% of the world's purified phosphoric acid and 95% of high-purity manganese sulfate. They also face supply volume risks based on the current project pipeline. Sodium-ion batteries offer some upstream diversification potential, with the United States and Europe playing active roles in soda ash, caustic soda, and biomass supplies. So given the growing competitiveness of LFP and emerging chemistries, it is becoming increasingly important for policymakers to pay close attention to supply chain vulnerabilities for these new battery chemistries.
In all of these discussions, it is also important to ensure that supply of critical minerals does not come at the cost of local communities or the environment. So as we've done in previous years, we've once again undertaken a systematic sustainability performance tracking to understand industry progress across various indicators. This analysis is based on a collection of publicly available data for 25 major companies who have a strong presence in energy transition minerals. So we've seen that companies are increasing their public reporting and growing their sustainability commitments, with indicators such as biodiversity commitments increasing by over 1.5 times in the past couple years, and almost 20 companies now having net zero emission targets in 2023, up from fewer than 10 in 2019. Even though reporting is improving, we can see that performance is still mixed. Social indicators such as investment and health and safety have started to show signs of stagnating in their improvement. But at the same time, we've started to see improvements in environmental indicators, with GHG emissions and water use falling more substantially in 2023 than in previous years. This is important, as environmental and climate risk can threaten the security of supply, as they limit market access, can create legal barriers, discourage investment, damage company reputation, increase the likelihood of opposition from local communities, and can also physically prevent mines and processing facilities from operating. For example, almost 7% of global copper supply is at risk of disruption from floods or droughts in 2024, which is set to increase further to 2030, putting almost 2 million tons at risk. This indicates that sustained efforts are needed for continued monitoring and mitigation of risks in order to ensure that critical mineral supplies are secure.
And just as a closure just IEA has been expanding its analysis on critical minerals. Also, we are working a lot on data collection, making some projections for supply, demand, investment, and so we will keep these activities going forward. And the global critical minerals outlook is one of the flagship publication in doing so. And also we make it available all our projection data through the online data tool called Data Explorer. So you can visit the IEA website and critical mineral topic pages to access all our projection data in a handy and user-friendly format. And also we are maintaining a tool called Critical Minerals Policy Tracker, where we compile almost 400 policy entries being implemented in different regions and different countries. And also finally, we are also working closely with our member countries on the IEA Critical Mineral Security Program to help the countries to enhance their resilience against some potential disruption and also build some diversified supply chains. With that, I will hand over to Tim for any question and answers.
Well, thank you so much, Tae-Yoon, and thanks very much to all the colleagues. In case you didn't see the nameplates, you heard from Tae-Yoon Kim, you heard from Shobin Deer, you heard from Eric Buisson, you heard from Alex Hegarty, Gyubin Hwang, and Amrita Dasgupta, and they are all here to answer any questions that you might have. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom to put any questions that you would like to see the group answer. We've had a few come in already, but I had a couple of things that sort of occurred during also the presentation. And it was very much consonant with something that the executive director emphasized during the launch presentation, how we are an organization here at the IEA that has a mandate and a responsibility to look closely at energy security. But there seems to be a broader set of vulnerabilities in play here, because we're talking about inputs not just to the energy technologies, but also to aerospace, to defense, to a variety of sort of advanced manufacturing. And so I wondered if maybe, Eric, you could explain for us, why it is that, we moved this year from looking at the battery metals and rare earths and copper, and all of a sudden we have 20 sort of strategic minerals as part of the analysis. What was the thinking there?
So when doing its analysis, the IEA started looking at the energy transition, and there was a number of minerals related to batteries, to solar PV, which were quite obviously the target of our initial analysis. But there's a wider range of metals and minerals which are also used by the energy sector in various applications, sometimes renewables, but also sometimes in more classical applications, such as in gas turbines, which require a very large amount of superalloys, and so those are very small specialty commodities. And so the energy sector is also sometimes a driver of those smaller mineral, those smaller commodity markets. And there's multiple factors that came into that suggested we needed to have a stronger interest in those. Firstly, the fact that the energy sector was driving such a large part of those markets. But there's also the recent analysis that was done on AI, and we tried to look at what were the critical minerals used in the AI sector. And so there was this report that was published recently, and the analysis was led by Amrita on the critical minerals side. And so we understood that gallium, etc., were minerals that were used both by the AI sector, but also, for example, for solar PV. And so that type of interactions were areas of strong interest for us. So I think those are maybe the main reasons that explain this desire for us to look at this from a bit of a wider perspective. But also what we effectively found was this number of very interesting data points and risks, which we've highlighted in the report.
Great, thanks a lot, Eric. I can see there's plenty of questions coming through now. There's one that even I can answer, which is, are the slides we saw today in the report? If not, how can we obtain them? So many of them are in the report itself, but we will be making this extended slide deck available to participants today. I'd like to turn to Tae-Yoon, because there was a couple of questions that came up quite quickly from Hari Krishnan to Siddhas on, can long-term contracts be seen as seen in the uranium sector help stabilize the markets? And then perhaps you can also comment on his other question about whether establishing international critical mineral stockpiles can help reduce supply risks. So maybe those two to you, Tian.
Yep. So we all pursue some more diversified supply, but today some new entrants and new projects are facing the challenges in attracting finance and investment because there are some lack of the stability in price and demand. So providing some degree of certainty and predictability on demand or prices can help enhance the investment viabilities. And there are some various tools that can help and work in this regard. And as my colleagues mentioned, and there are some tools to reduce, mitigate price risks, and also we can also provide some of demand certainty through public procurement channels and offtake and other mechanisms. So, and in terms of that, this offtake, long-term offtake can be a very valuable tool in enhancing the investment viability and also the reducing barriers. So it can work, and also there are some different models you can think in terms of offtake. And in some markets where industry is already feeling some pressures, and there are some natural the agreement between the offtake, but in other cases there are some chances that using some public procurement channels linking that to the offtake could provide some degree of certainty on demand. And also some recently, as Amrita mentioned, and there are some examples about the investing in rare earth project in France between Japan and France. And that is the co-investment is one vehicle, but also offtake of those materials to downstream the permanent magnet manufacture is one good example that offtake can play a role. And in terms of the stockpiling questions, and at the IEA, we have been working very closely with IEA member countries on the critical mineral security program. There are many elements within that, but the stockpiling is not a silver bullet for all situations, but in some cases, such as the minerals with very high level of concentration, very small market, and very opaque pricing structures, and also limited liquidity in the market. And in such cases, we think the stockpiling can be useful to cushion the potential impact of disruptions. But there are some countries already implementing some stockpiling, but there are some other countries considering in building that one. But when it comes to implementing or introducing stockpiling system, there are some various considerations one should review. So for example, what kind of model and who is responsible for holding stockpiles? Is public or the private or mix of both? And who can be responsible for managing the stockpile is one key question. And what minerals is best suited for this stockpiling is another question. And what are some cost implications? The cost for building warehouses, also the cost between the procuring these minerals and also gap between the buying prices or selling prices. So those need to be analyzed. And also there should be some close coordination with the industry stakeholders because there should be some industry need to consume these materials and there should be some close coordination among different stakeholders when building this stockpiling system. This is one area that IEA is working closely with our member countries to facilitate this kind of discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tian. There was a couple of questions on this issue of community acceptance of new projects and how can we be confident that new projects that are coming through with the necessary safeguards for not just their environmental performance, but also, their relationship with local communities. So there was one from Luke Danielson emphasizing how this is not just a technical issue, but a question of community acceptance. What can be done to make projects more acceptable? And I saw there was another question also about, given the fact that more than half of energy transition minerals are located on or near indigenous peoples' territories, essential to hold their right to free, prior and informed consent. And this is connected, of course, to the social license to operate for these projects. Can you please elaborate on how, some of these considerations, including indigenous people's rights, were integrated into our outlook analysis? So maybe, Alex, you can say some words on that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And this is such an important question. We've seen that community acceptance is a very important thing for companies to obtain, and when they don't, it can cause disruptions in supply of critical minerals, as local communities can often, as I said in my remarks, have opposition to projects, which then leads to closures of supply. And we've seen this all over the world across all minerals. Copper mines in Latin America or nickel mines in the Philippines. We've seen this happen. I think it's very important for companies to work with local communities from the very beginning, to consult with them and work with them. And some countries around the world have started to require this to happen. And there are also other avenues that can make projects beneficial for local communities as well, which can increase acceptance, such as benefit sharing agreements, which again, we've seen some countries like Canada and South Africa require companies. On Indigenous peoples and our social indicators, we collect data on some 35 different indicators across environmental, social, and governance metrics, but we only choose to show in our report ones where there is sufficient data. So we have looked at things like the rights of Indigenous peoples and how companies are reporting on this, but unfortunately we don't see a lot of reporting still at the moment on this metric. But it's definitely something that we include in our background analysis.
Great, thanks a lot, Alex. There was a question on battery chemistries from Zoe Furge saying, can you comment on the new LMR battery chemistry of General Motors and LG, and more generally on how new battery chemistries, apart from LFP, will affect supply needs? Maybe I can turn to Shobhan to take that one.
Sure. Thanks very much for the question. So lithium manganese rich, which is LMR, NMC, is a chemistry of a lot of high potential, a high energy density chemistry, which is an innovative chemistry which we hope to have a major impact. So this announcement is particularly exciting to open higher energy density and higher range electric vehicles. And the way this chemistry works, it is more lithium and manganese intensive and less nickel intensive. So this does have different impacts for the materials it requires. So this again is why we emphasize manganese, high purity manganese sulfate being such a concern going forward. Based on the project pipeline in 2035, the current supply pipeline only meets 55% of the demand in our base scenario based on current policy settings for manganese sulfate based on current deployment. Higher deployment of LMR, NMC, or any other manganese rich chemistries really does put extra strains on the manganese sulfate supply chain. So this is why it is a particular area of concern for us. Other areas beyond LFP is also worth looking at is solid state. And for solid state batteries, there are multiple chemistries being considered, the sulfides and oxide electrolytes, but lithium sulfide production is also an area of concern with very limited production right now, and also production of lithium metal if it comes to it. So there are many new areas with as chemistries progress, but obviously this is a bit of a longer term issue than the manganese sulfate issue, but there are many new materials that could become choke points in going forward.
Thanks very much indeed, Shobhan. And I have a couple of questions which I'd like to pose to Amrita. There was one asking if we had any thoughts about the impact of China export bans and US tariffs. I may be mistaken here, but I understood that there was an exemption largely for critical minerals on many of the tariffs. But certainly talking about the export bans, what does that mean for global supply flows? And then I saw another question about recycling, which would also go to Amrita. When making demand projections, what assumptions are built in with regards to the market share of recycled materials? What about manufacturing efficiency and technology innovation at driving down demand? So that's all to you, Amrita.
Thank you. Both extremely important questions. So I'll start maybe with the export controls. Talking specifically about the recently announced rare earth export control. So in April 2025, the Chinese government announced the implementation of export controls on 7 medium and heavy rare earth related items. This development has not yet triggered major surge in prices for these minerals, but the market dynamics could shift rapidly if actual disruptions to exports occur. Or delays arise in approving the export volumes to certain regions. China and Myanmar are responsible for about 2/3 of the global mined supply of heavy rare earth elements today. And the picture for refined supply is, of course, even starker, as we often highlight, with China accounting for about 90% of refined supply for heavy rare earth elements in 2024. So export controls like these could affect the efforts to build more diversified downstream manufacturing sectors, such as permanent magnet manufacturing in the case of rare earth elements, especially when coupled together with the 2023 export ban also announced by China on permanent magnet manufacturing technology and equipment. So we feel that mitigating the impacts of such export controls will require short-term measures, of course, but long-term resilience ultimately will depend on coordinated efforts to develop more diversified supply chains, which include all aspects of the supply chain, from mining, refining to magnet manufacturing. Now, maybe a few words on the recycling question. So in our modeling, so the critical minerals part of the model has inputs coming in from various parts of the larger model that has been developed at the IEA over several decades. We have different inputs coming in from the transport sector, from the industry sector, from hydrogen production, from power. And so there are built-in material efficiency assumptions in each of these models. But speaking strictly about the critical minerals model, we have recycling rates that vary depending on the scenario, depending on the policy ambition in each scenario. And we also incorporate material intensity improvements over time, and also over which also vary over scenario based on the technology and policy ambition in each scenario. On this, I would like to mention that at the end of last year, in November, we did a deep dive with a special report on recycling of critical minerals. So we invite you to take a look at that. And in that report, one of the key findings is that by mid-century, about 25 to 40% of the total demand for the 6 focus minerals that we analyzed can be covered by recycled quantities. And these recycled quantities come both from end-use technologies as well as manufacturing scrap. So yes, we invite you to take a look at the recycling report as well for more details. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Amrita. There was a question about how and why the demand for some of the battery metals or the projections for demand for lithium, nickel, and other metals in 2040 is significantly reduced compared to last year's projections. And I'd like to go to Tae-Yoon to talk us through that one.
Yep. So every year we reflect some latest data point and technology and policy trend on to make some demand projections for various metals. And compared with last year for battery metals, and we have revised down some demand for nickel and cobalt. But lithium demand stays remain quite similar to last year's, because we are seeing still strong, some robust deployment of EVs and energy storage applications. So there's some robust prospect for that battery deployment. So lithium demand, actually, we are staying quite similar to last year, but the nickel and cobalt saw some downward revisions because of the chemistry changes we are seeing in the battery sectors. As my colleague Siobhan mentioned, and nowadays we are seeing some major uptake of the lithium iron phosphate chemistry in the battery sector. So in 2020, it was less than 20%, but now it's almost half of the market is served by the LFP chemistries. And this is the growing in the electric car market, but also the energy storage applications, LFP batteries having some big influence in those applications. That have some impact on revising down the demand projection for nickel and cobalt. So we will keep tracking this latest technology development and try to reflect those in our metal projections.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Tae-Yoon. And I see a question came up about, do you have supply demand forecasts for other critical minerals other than the 6 focus minerals that you cover in your report? So I would encourage anonymous attendee to go to the Data Explorer. Because there you'll find a number of drop-down menus, and there's information there not just on the 6, but on the 20. So you can find a lot more information there across different scenarios, but also you can find some sensitivity cases there for different assumptions about battery chemistries and other bits and pieces. So I really repeat what Taeyin said. Please dig into the website and see, because there's lots of information there. I have a couple of questions which I would go to Gülbin for. So given your note on the salience of manganese and copper supply constraints, and especially concentration of manganese in China, did you consider deep sea mining providing these two metals, given recent US executive orders on deep sea mining? And then there's one other thing that I wanted to ask Gülbin about, because in the presentation, we spoke a little bit about the way that you could mitigate price risks for some of these critical minerals. Could you think through any examples of these kinds of mechanisms that operate in other markets? Any pertinent lessons for the critical minerals world from the way this is done elsewhere? So deep sea mining, and then that sort of read across from other price mechanisms.
Thanks for that, Tim. Right now, we have not included deep sea mining into our supply projections, but we do understand that many stakeholders think that these resources have the potential to address today's concentrated supply chains. But I think from the IE's perspective, we don't have an official position, but we are closely monitoring three key areas that policymakers are looking at across the world. First of these is processing diversification. Recovered mineral resources from deep sea cannot contribute to diversification if they are still processed and refined in today's government producers. Second are environmental concerns, and we are looking towards the ongoing discussions at the International Seabed Authority to develop the robust regulatory framework and improve scientific understanding of the environmental impacts of deep sea mining. And third, of course, the broader regulatory framework around the mining code that are being negotiated, and looking at how we can address issues like the environmental protection, financial terms, liability, compliance, and benefit sharing mechanisms. On the point about price stabilizing mechanisms in other sectors, many different minerals have different structures for how offtake is secured, and a lot of these minerals are secured, as Harry and Taeyin mentioned, on long-term offtake contracts. While offtake contracts are a key part of price stabilization for both producers and consumers, this also hides a fair bit of liquidity from the market, and liquidity and transparent price discovery are key components of designing mechanisms that can ensure price stability for different stakeholders across the supply chain. And we have seen expanded use of contracts for differences and cap and floor models in renewable electricity markets. CFDs notably have had a very large impact in supporting renewable deployment across the world for solar and wind. At the same time, we have seen that in times of price and cost fluctuations, governments have been exposed to uncapped budgetary exposures, resulting in difficulties for their finances. And so when we look at scenarios like in mining, where you have non-zero marginal costs of production, we think ensuring merchant risk is a key component of ensuring price stabilization whilst supporting the market. And we are also looking towards standards-based market access proposals to ensure that only minerals that meet specific sustainability or production criteria can qualify for access in specific market segments. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Gülbin, there's a couple of questions that I'd like to turn to Şoben to answer. So there's one about copper and the impacts of any sort of supply deficit on electrification. And do you see any substitution possibilities there? And I think there was a question also on the solid state supply chains in terms of lithium solid state. When can we expect commercialization? Solid state compatible for storage as well. So maybe, Şoben, I could ask you to take those two.
Sure. Yeah, thanks very much for the questions. So on the copper supply shortage, this is obviously a key concern for electrification, because copper is kind of the fundamental of all electrified technologies, but there are substitution options. Aluminium is the clear leader, but it does have 60% of the conductivity of copper. So there is a concern there and a loss of performance, though it is cheaper. The other aspect is there are some copper applications which cannot be substituted by aluminium, such as the anode current collectors for lithium-ion batteries. So there are some areas in subsea cabling and many other aspects which are very difficult to substitute with aluminium, but there are many aspects in transmission lines, electrification, that aluminium can serve the purpose. Though it is also worth noting that aluminium has 5 times the emissions intensity of production of copper, so there is also a downside on that end. But really, to meet the copper supply gap, or to close the gap, it requires not just substitution, also particularly needs new investment on the supply side, and on recycling needs to be scaled up, particularly raising collection rates for end of life copper, where it's critical, where there's lots of legacy copper in old buildings, etc., which is not being collected and recycled today. So there's a significant resource to tap into there. So now on the solid state battery supply chain side, so we're seeing two main categories of solid electrolytes emerging: sulfides and oxides. Sulfides typically rely on phosphorus and lithium sulfide, and so this will add additional pressures onto the phosphoric acid supply chains I mentioned earlier for LFP, and lithium sulfide, which is currently really in its infancy, so this could prove to be a bottleneck going forward. Oxides, on the other hand, rely on materials such as lanthanum, zirconium, and their production could be a future constraint. No immediate concern on supply. They're both byproducts, but this is something to watch, and they're predominantly mined in China. And finally, on the solid state side is the lithium metal. Battery grade lithium metal anodes, producing them at scale is very technically challenging, and at the moment, most of the capacity for it is set to be developed in China, but it is a real challenge to do that at cost. But solid state batteries, it's about costs, and producing it at costs is very challenging. And on storage side, I really don't think that solid state is appropriate for storage, where it's really about having the lowest possible cost. Storage is about high energy density, which is not important for storage, and this is where it is much more likely to be used in the premium segments, high range EVs, etc. Thank you.
Shobhan, before you vacate the microphone, I have another one that came in on the sort of battery chemistry side, and it also refers to the growing interest in sodium-ion batteries as a potential alternative or complement to lithium-ion. How do you see this technological shift influencing critical mineral demand and stockpiling strategies? Could the rise of sodium-based technologies alter geoeconomic dynamics by easing pressure on lithium supply chains, or might it introduce new complexities in mineral sourcing and market stability? Maybe some thoughts on that one.
Yep, thanks very much. So sodium-ion batteries are the first commercialized battery chemistry viable for EVs and storage that does not contain lithium. So this is a key advantage. It's much less critical mineral intensive. And the years of high lithium prices really drove major developments in sodium-ion, but the lithium price has fallen since, which has weakened the economic case for sodium-ion. But nevertheless, sodium-ion is already being used in EVs and storage applications, particularly in China, and the top global battery manufacturers, CATL and BYD, are already scaling production and have sodium-ion products available. So sodium-ion batteries offer some upstream diversification potential, as I was showing earlier, particularly because the United States and Europe play major roles in soda ash, caustic soda, and biomass supplies. The United States is actually the largest natural soda ash deposit in the world in Wyoming. So these are key areas of opportunity and to diversify supply chains. Yet when we look at the downstream supply chain, sodium-ion cells, cathode, hard carbon anode, are all dominated in China by the current capacity plans and announcements. So sodium-ion advantages include the superior low temperature performance, which has really driven its deployment in China. This reduced critical mineral dependency, but I would say the leading cathodes are layered oxides, which are typically nickel and manganese based. So again, the same pressures on nickel supply chains and manganese sulfate, as I've mentioned several times. But it does use the same manufacturing process as lithium-ion batteries, so it enables easy translation of existing lithium-ion gigafactories to sodium-ion. But we see a lot of promise and a lot of potential, and there's a lot of movement and gigafactory capacity being developed. But yes, there is some new pressures on other material supply chains.
Thank you so much, Shobhan. I think there's one for Amrita, and it's a question about the recommendation for collaboration in the case of rare earth elements. Projections focus on refining these in Asia, Europe, North America, Australia, Europe. But what about the possibility, for example, of these being planned for refining in countries like Brazil, which has the third largest reserves? In other words, global collaboration also requires involving countries that have historically used solely to extract materials in the refining process. So I think this speaks to a discussion about beneficiation and local value addition, which is which is very topical at the moment. It's also cropping up a lot in the G20 under the South African presidency. So maybe you can say a few words on that.
So thank you. That's an extremely important question, and indeed one that we have been working on for future reports, but also more for policy recommendations. We recognize that there's an increasing call for domestic value addition, for local beneficiation, for countries and regions that have historically played the role of resource-rich countries, where mining has been the main part of the value chain that that they contribute to. And we recognize that particularly in Africa and in Latin America, this is the case for several countries. So not just speaking about rare earth elements, where indeed Brazil has quite a large share of known reserves today, but talking more broadly about all critical minerals. And we do believe that local beneficiation is something that is a conversation, is a discussion for all policymakers to focus on increasingly. As Tim mentioned, we are also working on this with the South African G20 presidency on a report and on policy recommendations, and to identify really the key bottlenecks and obstacles towards growing along the supply chain in countries that have historically been more based on mining. So there are, of course, several infrastructure requirements in these regions in order to meet, in order to be able to move along the supply chain. And when we talk about global collaboration, this is, of course, included as a part of the global collaboration framework that we would like to present to all countries as not really a recommendation, rather a necessity in order to diversify global critical mineral supply chains. So investment in regions which have historically been mining countries and regions, so that they may have local benefits from their resources. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amrita. I'm actually going to go back to a question which came up quite early, and I think is worth posing to Eric about graphite. What can Western countries do to reduce their exposure to China in some materials? But maybe we can take graphite there as the pertinent example.
So graphite, among all battery minerals, graphite shows really strong and worrying levels of supply concentrations. That's true on the mining side. But then if you're looking at actual battery-grade graphite, the refining part, that's where you have the highest levels of concentration. This is plus 95% supply from one single country. So you're looking at very high levels of concentration. And so what we tried to do in the report was to look at the projects outside, which were coming up, investors looking at whether or not it was possible to build new projects elsewhere. And we did see a lot of opportunities, and many of them include some form of international cooperation. So we thought that was very interesting, of course, for this agency too. We want to be able to look at this, to look at where things are possible or not, and also we want to think of what are the best ways for countries to support that. So graphite can be sourced either from a natural source or synthesized, and on both sides actually you have those opportunities. On the natural side, there's a number of graphite mine projects popping up, some of them in Eastern Africa, some of them in developed countries such as Canada. And then the real bottleneck you have is refining of that graphite and that natural graphite into some sort of battery-grade product. And there you have a number of steps, including something called spheronization, which is very, very concentrated right now. And so the question is, where can we build projects? Can we have local beneficiation? To what extent? And then how do downstream supply chains support this? So this is on the natural side, but the question also exists on the synthetic side, because if you're going to be synthesizing graphite, you need to source some sort of carbon product, which is generally pet coke, and there's only a number of refineries outside of China which produce that type of product, and so there's also that discussion to have with fossil fuel, with all refiners, to see if this can be supplied. So there's both sides of this market we can look at. But what we can see is that policymakers are having a hard look at the topic because there's this high level of concentration, but there's also an increasing number of regulations around the sourcing of graphite from the key suppliers, and so people really want to make sure that those supply chains, I think, are secure. And I think this interest is really growing right now, and that's why we're seeing those investments. So there's both the question of facilitating cooperation, but also making sure that investments and markets take that into account.
Thank you so much, Eric. Well, I'm afraid we're reaching the end of our hour. Thank you so much for all of those questions. I think we've covered a lot of ground. There are some questions that are still still open in the Q&A, and maybe colleagues, where appropriate, can get back to our attendees where they've named themselves, just to provide some additional information. But to wrap up today, I'd like to pass across to Tae-Yoon for some concluding thoughts.
Yep. Thank you, Tim. For this year's the Global Critical Minerals Outlook 2025, we have obviously some in-depth review of the market trend in 2024, and also some detailed projection about the supply demand projection for key energy minerals. But there are two novel features I'd like to highlight. We had some deep dive analysis on key topics, including emerging the battery supply chain issues, and also policy mechanisms to incentivize diversification, and some of the promising mining, refining, the recycling technology on the horizon, and also some broader look at some post-20 stretching minerals and some their risk profiles. So, and also in the final chapter, we added some new chapter looking at some regional snapshot, looking at the state of play, and also the policy development of each region. And that is a new feature in this year's edition. It's a long report, but it's worth looking at. So I'd like to your stamina to go into these chapters, to review those chapters. And also just like to thank you for Tim, all this guidance, and also all the colleagues who have contributed to the study across the agency, and also thanks for all our peer reviewers and all experts who provided some valuable technical inputs. Thank you.